Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is now gone 9 o'clock. I would like to open our Finance and Audit Committee for this morning. It's good to see us here this morning. Staff, press, people in the gallery, your worship, welcome here this morning. I'd like to open up our meeting. So first off, we have apologies from Councillor Wilson. Moved by Councillor Seymour. Second by Councillor McLean. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Heather is on it. I haven't heard from either of these two. Yeah, I wondered what she was doing. Any declarations of interest? Okay, moving to the confirmation of non-confidential minutes. Moved by Councillor Stoltz, second by Councillor Dowsing. Any questions? Any matters arising? No? Okay. Move those as a true and accurate record. On to the action. Sorry? Oh, yeah. Can we move those as a true and accurate record? All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Action sheet.
I can just add to one of those before you you've got a little bit of a new printout, and it was just to update the number 4 on the actions that is currently recorded. And on the update, it's about the sensitive expense report to 30th of June, and it was said that one of the actions was to prepare another draft policy, and it's for councillors in the workshop and investigate and report back for other councils' policies. Now that originally was said about June, but just to give you a bit of an update of what we actually have done, we have completed other councils' policies, and part of that showed that there was a need to separate the sensitive expenditure policy from elected members and staff, and it showed that there were different criteria and requirements between the two groups. Not the least being the remuneration authority had specific terms and reference was only related to elected members. So the new draft policy, while it is being sort of in process, but we were waiting to receive after the July 2019 determination from the remuneration authority to actually include in the policy. Once that's done, we'll come back with the new review. And you can see that at that time. But the process has been underway, but we're just waiting for those other changes, and then you'll be updated with it. So I've just, as I say, that's on your written one, which says the full wording. The one that's in the action sheet just only had a brief reference to it.
Anything else from the action sheet? Councillor Seymour.
Then could we just understand whether the chair has worked with, and I appreciate it's not Councillor Forrihinger, to establish what areas need to be looked at more closely? I mean, there's a comment under 2 in the box that says it's completed, but we've not heard. So it's 06 18 120, just below the one you've just been speaking about. And there was to be a determination of what matters needed to be looked at more closely under finance and audit, and how often an internal audit is reported. So we've said it will be reported in May 19 with 6 months future focus, but we don't understand what areas are going to be more closely investigated.
And I can give, and that can be clarified, but for the chair, in the paper, May 2019, which was report 19163, it gave the full 6 months focus of what it was, and it said there was a number of things, but the determinant was making sure how especially a focus on the roading area, where we needed to make sure that the reporting and our efficiencies and effectiveness of reporting and be able to be up to date with that. And so that was one of the emphasis, especially with the volume of work, with all the facets, especially in the finance area, to be able to support that activity. And so that report did outline a number of things that they were doing within that, and that came to this committee here.
Thank you very much for that. So can I ask a supplementary, just so we're clear about what we can expect when, and I totally support the roading aspect. That was the internal audit program completed to 31 March. The next 6-month period would be 31 October. Are we expecting then that it'll be a full report then, or are we taking it from the date of May in here where we agreed the documentation? Which 6 months are we going to report on roading in?
So the 6 months, when that was taken from the June to December, there was an intensive review of all of that during that period. You will have quarterly reports and updates of what the internal audits are doing during this period. So there will be I would believe September, so council won't be at October, but you will have updates as well of what we're progressing along in that area.
But in actual fact, what you're saying, the roading one is not even none of these dates here, it's June to December.
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Seymour. Any other questions in regards to the action sheet? Right, move on to the governance work plan. No leave of absence or any of this other stuff. We'll head straight to the reports. Report for decision, fees and charges on page 19.
Just before it's taken, but most of it is taken as read, but so just as a summary, and it does state there, but the report for the final fees and charges for next year has occurred after the consultation in April and May period. The main changes within the environmental service and protections were kept at 30% of an increase, and Appendix 2, which is on page 63, just gives you a summary of what the process we have done to date and the reports that had the full information around the fees and charges, like the cemetery increases, and the process that we've done to date so far. And that's about it.
Mr. Hunter.
Has the revenue that will be generated by these new fees and charges, increased revenue, that been taken into account in our forward planning documents?
Yes, it does. It estimates what you need based on the revenue and financing policy, says this is how much rates you need, and this is the amount of percentage of fees. Then it's calculated and adjusted in those annual plan estimates.
Any other questions? Your Worship, the Mayor.
Penalty 25% late payment for dog registration, and the rate penalty is different. So why is it 25% and late payment for rates is lesser? What's the rationale? In the middle in the box, penalty of 25%. Yeah, 48. Is that a type error or is it intentional? Why such a big punishment? Well,
thank you. Sorry.
I think it's been traditional. There's two ways of applying this. You can actually, people pay for that deadline, and they had a reduced fee, or alternatively, they pay after that time and they pay the full fee. The way that it's been now worded is that it's actually a penalty, but the same quantum has been applied from a number of years. That hasn't actually changed. But it used to be that if you paid by 1st of July, it would say that you have a discount. But the quantum is exactly the same as it has been for a number of years.
Explain for the benefit of the mayor that it might be something to do with the terminology, just like you've just explained the issue around it can't be called a deposit anymore, that it's a application fee, because it does sound like it's a penalty.
Thank you through the chair, and thank you, Councillor Seymour. As just stated, there is what terminology can be used, but what I will do is I will actually check if penalty is actually set out in the Act, if that's the actual terminology, and that's why we're obliged to use that. And we'll come back to committee for the end.
And the rate.
Yeah, it's quite excessive.
The point being,
So we're talking about the 25% penalty charge that they're on payment, after payment. So
If you
is,
don't register your dog, you get punished 25%.
yes, which works out to be, depending on which category your dog is in, $20, $25 penalty.
Yes, but it's a percentage, which is no different to a loan shark. It could be $500 or $10,000, but it's the amount of interest that you actually charge. The other thing too I want to bring up is that I often get phone calls because I always coach people, obviously, but people say that they can't afford their dog fees, right? And obviously my thinking is, how many have you got? They got 3, and then they got to feed them and take them to the vet and everything. So I said, well, you better start saving your $2 a week now. But I say to them, I know that I'm not supposed to, but I say to them, pay something, and just keep paying. Give them 5 checks if you have to. I know that it's not the right way, but at least they've tried. And the thing about it is that if the council takes them to a tribunal or something, they're going to lose because they've actually attempted to pay.
Thank you, Worship. Councillor
So
Nelson?
is there a provision for at least a part payment in the policy rather than come up? Because, you know, you can pay, you've got good system for rates, you've got good systems for other payments, then why isn't it for other things?
Back to with regards to those good things and how they actually apply it with it. But just to be mindful that the $20 has been sort of imposed all the way through, either as a person who pays on time or those that don't, they get the full rates, full cost of the application, which is another $20. So we can come back with regards to if there is anything, how they apply it on the things, but the majority of things is to encourage people to pay in the first time rather than it to be paid part way through the year. And it is required to be paid always at up front.
Councillor Dowsing.
Thank you. I just wanted to finish up on that same topic, actually. Our fixed charges are set out by our fixed costs in-house, so our staff charges. So this being a fixed charge for a fee, is the 25% a penalty above our cost recovery, or is it a incentive, which means you're getting a discount from our cost recovery? If it is a penalty, I believe that the Mayor is asking whether that penalty should be standardised against our other penalties. And if it isn't standardised against our penalties, then this is a high percentage. And I believe that the Mayor was asking whether we should reduce that penalty cost to standardise it.
Again, I'll just say what was before. It was saying that you had a discounted rate, well, from the first thing, and then the rate afterwards. So the recovery is based on the amount of fees that's calculated based on approximately 80% of people pay on time.
But
And then the other costs come thereafter. So the actual costs that you need to be required for the dogs, which is 80%, of the total cost, is calculated within the fees. It's not as a penalty, and this is over and above. It is actually calculated with the estimated cost needed to fund the operations of dogs.
For a number of teams of dogs, and that is not right. When you slip up or the accountant slips up, it is the normal charge plus the 25% to square things up. Only happened once, but it did happen.
Thank you, Bill. Councillor Burdett, sorry. Councillor Stoltz.
So we've spoken about this quite a few times, and I'm happy to move this paper because we've pointed out some issues that we are concerned with. But I'm heartened by the fact, number one, in our background does say most charges are going up by the rate of inflation. However, some fees have increased further to recover actual and reasonable costs. And this is in line with the revenue and financing policy we have, where we say when costs are created where we can identify individual benefit, that we will then charge it there. So I'm heartened by the fact that staff are saying we've looked at what it actually costs to do that service, and this is what we are proposing. So, and that's the reason why I'm happy to move this paper. There are some still work to be done that we've identified with some clarifications, but overall, the principle behind this is in alignment with our revenue and financing policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stoltz. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, moving forward, we've got to, as Councillor Stoltz said, cover a cost, but I think it sort of, we need to continue to realise we are a monopoly business. We don't have competition from other like operators to try and keep our pencil sharp. So we have to be looking at keeping our pencil sharp on our own, and that's sometimes a tricky thing. So I endorse what was said earlier on, where we'll be looking at our cost structures, trying to keep them down because they are a significant cost to society, and our job is to try and help society function the best we can within budgets. So yes, and also our risk for appetite. I think that's something we need to look at down the track, because a lot of these costs are built around risks, and I'm talking about over the whole sphere of our fees and charges, and just see if we are being a little bit top-sided with our risk metrics. So yep, moving forward, we've got to do something. We've got to recover our costs. Let's do it, but at the same time, don't take our eye off the ball that it's a lot of money for people out there, and be aware of that.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Curtis-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just really interested in regards to this new vehicle that we're seeing driven around our streets, the motorised scooter, in the bylaw space. Has that been updated? Because there's a lot of speaks to, riding on footpaths, etc. And I just wondered also, when we're talking about, page 47, I just wanted to know whether, when we are talking about our fees and charges and the bylaws that exist alongside them, how much communication out to our public, so there is a clear understanding, because I feel that whilst we had no submissions, there's still a lot of information, people aren't clear, and so how are we clearly determining or giving to our citizens information, with changing kind of modal as well as just in this space, are we being really clear with our determinants of why and an outward media space? I'm just asking. Sorry, page 47 has just got a whole lot of debate, a discussion around riding a skating device, and I was just asking. Yeah, so. Oh, well, I guess, sorry, yes, I appreciate your point of order. When I see the charge, I'm interested to know whether, are we monitoring this space and are we getting any charges? Like when I look at $60 first offence, 109 second offence. My apologies, my brain is a little fuzzy today, but just we talk about these costs and charges, and how are we managing that space in respect to scootering and new motorised scooters on our footpaths? I just wondered, I'm just asking in respect to that, because
That sounds like maybe it's more of an enforcement kind of question with the increase of motorised scooters. I'm not too sure if there's a fee part there, but Mr. Zem, did you have a reply on this?
Thank you through the chair. I'll try and answer the question. So this relates to actual damage caused to property and the recovery of it. There's a big increase in scooters, and there is actually a restriction on the power level of the scooters that you can ride on footpaths and those that you actually need to take on the road. It's still quite a grey area, and it's an issue of enforcement for the police. But I can assure you that the Gisborne District Council electric scooters that we have been restricted to within the power limit so that they are able to be ridden on footpaths at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Zem. Councillor Dowsing?
Thank you. I was just going to ask the Chair if this is our opportunity to discuss the topics in the workshop this morning. Okay. Thank you. So I had a few questions around the workshop this morning, which the public won't have, unfortunately, because it wasn't in the agenda, but it was around these are questions I'd asked in a previous finance and audit meeting, but was referred to ask at the workshop, which was around our efficiency and whether we are being as efficient as possible. And it was highlighted in the workshop this morning when we are setting a new charge out rate for senior officers, for example. I'd like to know whether those senior officers are going to charge all of their time out as a senior officer, or whether they will be charging senior rates for senior officer on certain tasks which require a senior officer, or whether you just may be charged more because a certain person worked on that project for you. Likewise, is there an allocation for junior officers being thought of? Because we know that we have staff turnover in this area. We know that we have some loss of institutional knowledge, meaning that people may not be working as efficiently as possible. So potentially a junior charge would have been suitable as well. We had a lot of benchmarking against other councils, and again, benchmarking is fabulous, but only when used against, in terms of affordability. It's irrational to just put comparison directly on councils which may have a completely different demographic in their community and a different affordability. There was other items, like, for example, the record retrieval in building services, a $45 charge for digitisation of council's content. That feels to me like payment for legacy or historic work, where the management and handling of those documents shouldn't be the burden of the person getting a LIM report. It should be the burden of council to digitise or file or do whatever is required of that work, because it is our asset, not theirs. And I can't remember if I made any more notes or whether we just ran out of time. I think we ran out of time. But yeah, I had several questions around the topics within that presentation, and unfortunately we didn't get to actually delve into it before moving the fees and charges.
Thank you through the chair. There are a number of questions and statements in there from Councillor Dowsing. I'll try and make sure I answer all of them, but do remind me if I've missed some. In terms of the fees and charges associated with a senior officer as opposed to an officer. So as talked about in the workshop, council staff have been through a benchmarking, a process to actually determine how much time is spent by staff, including administration for that staff. There are certain tasks which are common across councils where the majority of the work is done, and it will be required a senior planner or a senior manager to actually sign off and check those that they're all in order. So council charges in terms of the amount of time. So no, it's not charged in terms of a senior doing 5 hours work across the board. It might be 3 hours work by the junior officer or the officer, and that's a standard charge out rate, and the actual checking and the sign off of that and the review of the content of that is charged at the senior officer rate. So those charges have been generated in terms of the different officers in time spent. The other question in terms of, so it's just charged at officer rate, that's a standard rate, and how that was actually calculated was that there is a band range within that rate, and the average is taken in terms of that. So that's it. We could make things more complicated by trying to encompass every band rate from a junior starting, but there's an average taken in terms of that officer, and essentially there's a similar rate applied to those officers processing resource consents. Sorry, was there another question that you?
I guess the only other question would be around the digitisation of our content and whether that should be a cost on the community in terms of that record retrieval fee. It's probably still more of a discussion topic, would have been better in the workshop. It's not saying I expect staff to answer here.
Just to touch on some of those great ideas around digitisation and future thinking about how much debt we're going to carry in regards to all of our future fees and charges and stuff like that. I think they're all really good future focused topics, so they're definitely been taken down right. So yeah, so it's great to hear those things also in this part of the meeting as well. Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking at the consents deposits, and I think I'd like to see it made very clear that when you're applying for a building consent sale, a new dwelling, it's $600, and I'd like to see that it's spelt right out, because we have a lot of our people out there that would think that that might be their only costs. And, you know, we know ourselves that it could go from $600 up to $3,000 if you're reimbursing staff time, depending on how well the consent in that form is filled out and how much information and the right information. So I'd like in that conversation that it is $600 deposit, but it could be as much as $3,000, just for good clarification, and or more.
Thank you, Councillor McLean. I want to echo support for your sentiments around managing community expectations around what they're expecting regarding future building consents and stuff. Your Worship.
Just two things. The page 38, Marquee's application. So it might need there's a lot of people actually set up a bit of a marquee for tangi. A lot of that's happening at home now. So you might need a bit of descriptive. What is a marquee? What is the area or size before you actually attract the fee? All right. Is there an answer for that at the moment?
Through the chair, no, not at the moment.
Because most people set up a simple structure. Like this one's at school, you just pull out, put up, and so does a vigilant council officer come along and says, oh, $100 please. So just in case it slips through, because I'm mindful I go to a lot of tangi that are at home now. Okay. And the other thing is, philosophically, have you taken into account a public good? Because everybody that applies for a building consent or a or more particularly a resource consent, there's a public good component to it because it's actually protecting the environment, ensuring that the neighbours are not is not offensive to people's surroundings, and the philosophical thing about the visuals and all that sort of stuff. Has there been a public good component, or is it totally user pays?
Thank you, through the chair. The public good component, how much the actual user pays is actually determined in the policy itself. So what level of public good component is actually put forward on the ratepayer as a through targeted rates. It's not, that's actually considered in the policy, what percentage we're going to recover through that, and that's where that is actually considered. It's it.
I have to come back to you. I know in some of them it's about 80% so fees and charges, and there might be a 20% public good, but in that particular one, I'd have to actually come back to you.
And there are still a schedule of costs being carried by council because the increases are not going to the full attributed cost from the workshop this morning. So there is still.
Okay, yes.
Does this mean, if I read this right and listening to his worship, that sports grounds, be they horse sports, be they athletics, when they put marquees up, they're going to give us $100 to be able to put it up? Because you think about it, you have a look on TV, there's heaps of marquees there, oversized tents. Well, I'm asking for clarification. Do we charge for that too?
Good question, Councillor.
Thank you, through the chair. We'll go back and check. I think this actually refers to the actual permanency, and there needs to be some more clarity around that, not just putting up a marquee for a short event, but the permanency of a marquee that's going to stay up for some amount of time.
I think you need a descriptive. Yeah. To actually inform the community that if it's up there more than 3 days or 5 days, it's okay. But then actually at the end of the day, it's really about the safety, isn't it? It's not about the length. No. So you really need to have a bit of descriptive on the sides. Because, you know, like Malcolm's street party, every tent up there will be paying $100 plus the occupation fee, plus the food hygiene fee or food compliance fee.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Yeah,
Councillor.
I was just going to comment that I think this is basically an events fee, erecting events, erecting at public events, not private. But
Thank you, Councillor Dowsing.
Yeah, I was just
Last one, Councillor Seymour.
I just want to draw your attention, since we are discussing that marquees, it's got a wee note 2 at the end of it. If you look at it on page 38, if you look at 2 over the page, which I take to be the reference, it isn't really clear. So what the Mayor did ask is, can we have some clarity? Because it talks about deposit and standard fee, number of inspections, etc., which I think is equally confusing. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to second the report. I believe it's been moved, but
So
not been
move.
seconded.
Thank you very much.
Subject to clarification.
Yeah, so subject to clarifications, and those will come back in regards to clarifications around marquees in the action sheet.
And the dogs, 25%.
And the dogs. Thank you very much, Your Worship. So it's been moved by Councillor Stott, seconded by Councillor Seymour. All those in favour? All those opposed? Carried. The next paper we're going to is the Statement of Intent, page 81, with GHL. Thank you very much for being here today, our GHL family. It's nice to see you guys. Great to see you guys later on this afternoon. Yes. I'll invite them to come to the table. I'd like to invite you guys actually to come to the table while we have this discussion. So, yeah, just okay then. No. This meeting is quite chunked, and I was being polite. But thank you very much for also being polite back. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. The person that's coming in to talk to us in regards to Treasury policy, their plane has been delayed and it looks like that they'll be landing around about 10:40. So we'll go through the other papers prior to coming back to item 10.2. So page 81, 10.3, GHL SOI.
Yeah, I'll just give us a summary of it. So basically, as it stated, the draft SOI is submitted to council before the 1st of March. You have had your own workshop on the 4th of April. Changes were then sent to what your expectations on the GHL on the 18th of April, and then you had a joint workshop between GHL and yourselves. And the outcomes of what were the major discussion points with that is in the body of the report. And as you'll note in the attached SOI, all of those changes were accommodated and they're shown in the yellow how that was discussed. If there are, as I say, most of them, if there's any particular ones that you wanted to have further ones, we can just go over those.
Thank you, Ms. Foreman. Moved by Councillor Dowsing, seconded by Councillor Akata-Brown. Questions, Councillor Seymour.
Yes, thank you, and I apologise for my back. I just wanted to make sure that we were all clear, our directors of the holding company as well, with respect to the review of services under 17A of the Local Government Act, which is referred to on the last line of page 81 of 143, and then is referred to again over. And I just wanted to ask that it's in 26 on page 85. Is everybody on the same page and happy about what's expected of that requirement? I want to know, please. We've had half a discussion about it in a previous workshop. Are the directors comfortable with what, and are both parties quite clear?
Well, the discussions that we did have before it in there and subsequent with the CE, we sort of said that and that would come back, and it was reflected in the statement of intent that they are committed to providing that within the year. So in the statement of intent is GHL, so they would have had as by reference that they agreed to the statement of intent. But if you're asking for other further clarifications,
no, I'm just asking if both parties, because we're assigning them, we're agreeing to accept the statement of intent. I'm trying to get to the bottom of whether GHL directors and council officers are in agreement about what's required. I don't actually need to know today what's required, but it is new and we've had the discussion. Are both parties in agreement about what is required for that?
categorically said that will comply with an assist DC, but fundamentally section 17A is a requirement for review. So we'll assist and work with them, but it has to be led by GDC. We can't come up with what the review will be. I don't know on section 17A. But we're happy, we know it was discussed last year, and we're always willing to work. So saying it's an operational thing, I believe as long as we get together. We're making a clear statement from what we're.
Great. Thank you very much. And so I'd also just like to commend the directors of GHL. And when we talk about the financials and the contribution that they make, we need to remember that in addition to the fund, the direct grant that is made to Gisborne District Council, they have also funded this building and they've funded substantial upgrades to the swimming pool, which we would never have been able to fund, plus the swimming pool at their motor camp and the upgrade to the accommodation at the motor camp. So we acknowledge that the resources of the holding company are substantially benefiting the community in addition to the direct grant that council receives. So thank you for that. I was happy to move or second it, but it has been moved and seconded, so I'm fine.
Thank you, Councillor Seymour. Mayor Foon.
So there's the $10 million threshold, right? So is there an opportunity, if there's something so good and that it's going to be beneficial to the GHL and the council, can they present to the council and put their case up for above the threshold?
So just a clarification, that is above the threshold, they come to council to seek approval. Below that, they operate on their own decision-making process.
I didn't see it, but is there no surprises with me?
Yes.
It's been fairly well crawled over.
If there are no other questions, been moved by councillor Dowsing, seconded by councillor Kurata-Brown. All those in favour? All those against? Carried. Excellent, great SOI. Thank you very much to the directors and the board of GHL, also to our staff in bringing this to fruition. I'd like to move us on to report 11.1, page 101, the quarterly activity report.
That's just taken as read. You would have had in other committee reports just a brief overview of what's happening. The activity summary is up to the 31st of March, but the financials are at the 30th of April.
Councillor Stoltz.
A few little questions I've noticed. This one first, something that caught my eye on page 104 that I would love Pauline just to answer about total capital expenditure in our commercial operations finances. Just the unbudgeted spends on Awarua leasehold improvements will be the cause of an unfavourable year-end look. Can you please elaborate on that? I've never spotted that before in this paper. Thank you.
Sorry, is that better? Okay, sorry about that. Outside the actual gardens that are out there, there's irrigation systems that wasn't in there before, so there's a partial of those. There is some little bit of office changes that the Mayor's office PA has got a window outside that area, and there were some other electrical changes with moving of some of the desks around. So that was not within the sort of the plan, but it came afterwards.
And then I'll zip it. This is for Mrs. Conn. We it's a discussion on page 112 that talk about us live streaming and having virtual meetings. I was just wondering, do you, can you see how many people log on, how many people, how long they watch for, so that you can see if there's a growth in that area?
Could we have a report on it?
Through you, Chair, yes, we can monitor that, and there has been no growth. I can actually see the numbers that are on when we're in the meeting. It's one of the most efficient things it's doing is it's meaning that staff can watch and be working and then come to the meeting when it's time to come to the meeting.
So how many people are watching now? Two.
It says it on the screen.
How many?
Yeah, two, and it's staff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Through you, Chair, I have been reminded that it does depend on what the issues are being discussed.
So thank you for that. It's very interesting. We should keep watching to see us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stoltz. Councillor Seymour.
Can I'd like to ask an issue around this page on the commercial operations, and I'm not sure that I might have been asleep, and I'm not usually asleep in here. The focus of the council airport asset is to aid economic value for our area and maintain a strategic asset, and it infers that it doesn't have a commercial return. Did we actually make that decision, or how did we arrive at the lease agreement, which we know took a long time to be signed? But is it really that it says in the heading, is not primarily focused on profit? I would have thought we might have thought there would be some profit from a substantial asset like that, which is of considerable value and actually does belong to the ratepayer. So can we have any explanation about how that decision was made and what elements were considered in the reaching of the agreement on the recent lease?
Page 103 of the agenda.
So those were a number of papers that were brought back to you with regards to what were the provisions and how would the lease be set and the rates. And you also had, as part of that, it was a comparative of a lot of the airports throughout New Zealand. And it said, what was the cost to operate those airports?
Yes.
And what was an overwhelming, was shown that there was more ratepayers impact than there was in any profit. So basically, in most of them, that was costing quite a considerable amount to the areas concerned. So ours was trying to recover most of those costs that we actually have, and we weren't in that situation where prior to the lease of it, where we did have the operations of the airport. We were trying to make sure that we covered those kind of costs and any other cost recoveries with regards to the rates as well. But also it was identified all the way through that it was a strategic asset, but also making sure that the person that was operating it could operate it and they could be in business. So those kind of papers did the strategic directions of it and actually gave you the sort of the background of how it was arrived and what were the key principal overarching things that you as governance wanted to make sure that it was achieved within the final lease arrangement.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember all those papers. It's the terminology that is used here that actually prompted my questions, because we know that we were funding it was costing us money even under the lease prior to the new lease agreement, but it just seemed to determine that it was only of those, that its asset was for economic value and maintain a strategic asset. If it had a few more sentences like, and we now know that their upgrade to the airport runway is something that will come back to us at no cost, whereas it just tends to read here, and especially the terminology not focused primarily on profit, but on benefits. Okay, thank you very much. And likewise, yes, forestry assets actually should have a profit bent as well as the erosion control focus as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Seymour. Councillor Foster, microphone please, Councillor Seymour.
Yeah, thank you. Just want to refer to page 120, and it's about our percentage of resident satisfaction with how rates are spent on services and facilities. And we've got in quarter 1, 28%, quarter 2, 33%, and quarter 3, 42%. So one would think that those results are very disappointing with our percentage of residents that are satisfied with how we are spending on our rates. Is there any comment on that? And I know we've lowered the rate to 60% satisfaction as opposed to a target of 90. Our target is now 60. So why are we not aiming to for a way higher percentage? And what's causing the concern out there?
We can come back a little bit more in detail because I haven't got all of the things here. However, some of the questions, we find that if there's direct contact with our ratepayers, that the actual results returned are a lot higher than what these particular ones are saying. And they actually is up well above, the 70 or 80% requirements. But I need to come back, probably just give you a little bit more details with regards to those, the way that it was done and what are other surveys that are overlaid with this, just to give you a bit more of an overview.
All right. The other one is on page 121, and that we have completed testing of the online building consent application tool, online services, and are now finalising all application type forms. It's great to see that we're all going digital, making it really easy for our customers to access building consents and the process. My question is this going to make it faster and more affordable? I know we've gone through our fees and charges thing at the moment, and particularly around the consenting side. So so the whole process is obvious. I would think would be obviously to help speed it up and possibly make it more affordable.
So through the chair, it should make it easier for the customer to provide the right information. So some of the delays occur if the right information hasn't been received, and then that creates backwards and forwards until we've got that, then that gets lodged, so it creates a time delay. So it should create an efficient process, which would reduce the time required at the processing side, which in theory would reduce the fees required depending on the hours.
Right, I've got one more too. On page 129, and we've got net debt per capita based on 2013 census. Why are we still using 2013 census to base that on?
I think that's the next paper. You've gone to the next paper, I think.
There's the 2018 one, and we do have other
You want
more update. Pardon?
page 129 is the next paper.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. I'll leave with that then.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Foster. Councillor Dowsing, then your worship, the member.
Thank you. Yes, I actually had a question on the digital technologies as well, and it was around efficiency. And so we are collecting the data from the applicant now digitally. What I'd like to know is if we have any intention to further that process and put in place some automation to assist the staff in terms of that data handling once it's collected and assisting the staff processes, because to achieve efficiency, we need to then do something with the data that's collected instead of just collecting it.
So through the chair, we've talked a lot around how our underlying system is preventing a lot of major changes to add more on top of that by way of efficiency. So the building consent one is relatively easy because we've taken some software and we've added it to our processes. Then if you add in some regional resource consents, it starts getting clunky. Then the linking into our customer database becomes more difficult. So this is a long response to the question, but I do feel that the committee would benefit, or council would benefit, from understanding the constraints that we have around our legacy systems because what we'd like to do is move away from our legacy systems, which is going to be a mammoth task, a big capital project, in order to get to that point where we can provide better solutions and be efficient internally with other types of technology opportunities.
Thank you. Just supplementary. On that point then, if we're going to look at moving away from our legacy systems, will there be a return on investment assessment done before we do it? For example, what efficiencies we expect to gain, what reduction of cost to the community therefore, and at what cost?
Will have to be, because so I've had quotes up, so it'll be $6 million to overturn the legacy system and put in something new. Well, not quotes, but people quoting back to me. But I don't know if that's actually the case, and we need to unpick that more. So we've got to do that analysis. But I think it's really beneficial for council to understand what those constraints are in our current systems and what's preventing us from being more agile.
Thank you, Councillor Dowsing. Your worship, the mayor.
To the digital strategy. So I would encourage that we're part of the local government family, and we're not the only one doing this. So hopefully there is collaboration with other councils. They've got lots of money that we can actually just dovetail into a system, right? Just pay them a fee. And the other thing is, in the forms, when you fill in the forms, if you have some key information that you really need for the building consent, you should not be able to progress to the next page till you actually, because there's a lot of other forms online that if you don't fill in your name or your address or your DP rates number, you don't get to the next stage. So that actually helps the applicant, rather than saying, oh, I filled in the form, I thought I filled in the form, but I've actually missed out some of these things. So if you can have some key asterisks, because I've noticed that in the trial, that it doesn't have those sort of things, and even in resource consent forms. And obviously there's a save, so you can save for the next day.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Seymour.
Thank you. I was just going to make the observation, if we are going to do those kind of things, we need to make sure that technology provides us with a good service, because, it seemed last weekend that no one knew that some people didn't have access until they loaded it, drew it to officers' attention themselves. So if we're going to have technology, then it needs to be reliable, and when when we do have to have in-house fixes, they make sure that everyone's going to have access to the documentation following that. The other thing I'd like to speak about with respect to these reports, I mean, we don't have the coloured dots, for want of a better word, on Q1, 2 and 3. And I mean, we've been collecting this data for all year. This is not unsimilar to reports that we had yesterday. And I did read a note somewhere that said we weren't able to provide that information, but we should be able to. I mean, we're making an assessment and the codes are not in. I'm just looking for at 111 and 112, and we've got a couple of green dots. Unless you're telling us that, and I mean, they are Q1 of this year and Q2.
So most of them relate to the annual charges, and that information is not available. It's actually not.
Well, this is talking about democracy support and governance. And we've got Q4 in. I don't want it now. All I'm saying is if we're going to do it, let's make sure we make the system work. Otherwise, let's use another system. And the other thing that tickled my fancy, and I'm just asking out of interest, it tells me on page 109 that we're hosting TIHA commemorations in 2019. And I think that this council probably knows the least about what's going on in TIHA than anybody else. So if we're hosting this, progress on plan years 1 to 3, it tells us on year page 109. Can we have another update? We've had lovely updates in the Gisborne Herald and schedules of activities that are on. And it's only when we ask that somebody comes in here and talks to us about what the latest plan is. So apart from the good print material, which the Gisborne Herald has provided to us, maybe we can have another relationship with the people who are managing TIHA. It'd be really lovely to know how many tall ships are coming. Yes, I see that. Yesterday it was reported that our harbour master is going to have a significant role because of the activity that will be on in the harbour. So let's hear about what that activity is going to be.
Thank you, Councillor Seymour.
So just in terms of that, I believe it was our last council meeting where Glenys, Philip, Barbara and Tune discussed what those events they had planned. So they have provided that update to council, and we're just now refining what the expectations are for our council in terms of how we can support them. So yeah, happy to bring back something when it's more concrete. At the moment, it's still moving parts.
Thank you. Thanks for that. It's big picture stuff, but let's hear what really is going to happen and what is going to be on the harbour.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Seymour. Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hey, just in regard to the digital government and the strategy around IT, I just was interested to know whether do we get enough information around, because there is a collective of our constituents who don't have, as much access to internet. There's been a movement forward and changes, but we still know there are those who prefer not to, use online. They want to see face to face. So do we get enough kind of data around, is that changing? Is that getting better? Is that service? Because we know it's the new changing world of modern technology, but has everyone still got access to that? Is it equitable? Because we do know there are portions of our public that don't have as much access.
So through the chair, the majority of our transactions are over the counter. So we're still heavily, face-to-face customer interaction. And that could be because our online service is limited. And when we talk about, ability to have forms online, it is just that the forms online that you then have to print off, fill out, and then come in and, and sit down. So there's a lot of technology improvements that we need to make. We currently have people are associated by way of a parcel, of a land parcel, rather than a person tag. So you can't, it's very difficult for you to come in and provide us an online service that's focused around a customer, because we're looking at the land parcel rather than the person. So there are a whole heap of things that are sitting in behind that prevents us from fully providing a really good online service. So in the meantime, there is really no choice for some of the services that we provide apart from coming in over the counter.
Dean, I just, hearing from around the table, we're still in this movement forward as a council. I can sense it. Yeah, we're still, that relationship between our ratepayer, you know, the comms and all that. There's been a massive amount of work in this space and it's ongoing. So, no, thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, councillor Coates-Brown. Mr. Hunter.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman. New Zealand, with a population approaching 5 million, is smaller than a lot of cities and other places in the world. And yet we tend to like to develop, I know in the educational sector and the health sector, we like to create individual technology projects. I'm just wondering, with this move towards digitisation, just the level of cooperation, and is there a national umbrella organisation monitoring things so we're not all reinventing the wheel? Thank you.
So through the chair, there is a group of chief executives from the local government sector that have been supported by Department of Internal Affairs to look at a digital transformation type project. There are also a number of our shared services arrangements, so Botplas, Hawke's Bay LAS, and then there are the bigger councils like Auckland that are looking at providing, as His Worship the Mayor pointed out, let's not reinvent the wheel, let's tag into what other councils are doing. So potentially they become a service provider for us. So the wider local government sector is really clear that it needs to be joined up more because we're all doing our own thing, and we don't want to, we can't afford to, because then we end up stuck with systems like we have, and people aren't working here anymore, and the only provider was sitting somewhere in Hawke's Bay. So, you know, we have all these difficulties, so we're definitely trying to get some more alignment there so that, I mean, overall the ratepayers nationally could benefit if the sector joined up more. But I guess at the end of the day, it is also about how individual councils manage the processes behind. So it is about people and it's about processes before we move to technology intervention and getting those aligned.
Thank you, Ms. Thatcher-Swan. That seems to be quite thrashed out. Do we have a mover and a seconder for the paper? Moved by councillor McLean, seconded by councillor Dowsing. All those in favour? All those against? Let's break for morning tea. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you very much, Mr. Zaman. We will move on to paper 11.2 on page 123, financial report to 30 April 2019. Councillor Foster, then Councillor Dowsing.
I did mention before about the using the 2013 census for, this is on page 129, and it's been there for a long time for our population breakdown of our debt per head per capita. I'm just wondering why we're still using the 2013 census for that when we've got way more than, and the population at that date was way less than what it is right now. Even though the 2018 census is contentious, we've got other updated information on our population that we could be using. So just a query on that, because it's really outdated. So that's one.
For the chair, just to answer that, the actual 2018 census is not available until the 23rd of September. So we have to use the census data that was available at the time of the LTP. And so that's what's over there. When we get more, when the relevant information is updated, yes, those figures are updated at that time too.
All right, yeah, fair enough, we'll be compliant. The other one is on page 134, and under conveniences, we've got two projects, Peel Street toilets, 400k 4-year budget, which is still there. And then it says we've got next year's annual plan, we've got a 280k provision in next year's annual plan. So does that mean the 400k gets carried forward and we'll have 680k in that Peel Street budget next year?
No, clarification, it is only 280 and that's the unspent portion of the 400 that was in this year. So only 280 as in next year.
So what happens with the 120?
There was, through the chair, there was a paper, I believe, in April, which stated what, if there was a need to be reprioritisation of those funds, and it was approved at this committee saying that some of those funds could be used for other purposes. I don't have them what it is, but yes, and that was outlined fully in that report.
Okay.
No, I don't think we allocated money that way to the museum.
Mr. Chairman, we moved that money be carried over until, yeah, no, I mean, I don't know who's been fiddling with the numbers, but that's not correct.
I can come back with the clarification. There's only 280 that's been carried over to next year. There's been earmarked in the annual plan for that. The actual resolution that and what I actually had in there, I can give you a bit of an update when I just get the report.
Oh, Councillor Dowsing, then your wish.
Thank you. I think there's some confusion about that, and it's just that 280k was provisioned to be spent next year, with the remainder was supposed to be spent this year.
Yeah.
Neither of which have happened, so the full budget is still available, I believe.
I'm pretty clear that is the case, Councillor Dowsing, and I've asked Ms. Foreman to come back with that clarity.
I was actually just going to make a comment and take a little bit of humble pie. Page 135. We see these graphs all the time, and I always comment on the fact that you never accelerate out of the trend. And here we are, actually performing above expectations in our capital expenditure. So that is awesome work for that period. Hopefully it doesn't taper off towards the end of the year. But yes, that's impressive to see, and I'll commend staff on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll move the paper if it hasn't been moved.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dowsing. Moved by Councillor Dowsing, seconded by Councillor Stoltz, your worship, the Mayor, and then Councillor Singh.
I don't think the word fiddling is a very good word to use here. Right. Anyway, I want to go to these two matters, right? One is a technical thing. Page 140. What are they? The graphs. the pull-out one, 136, and I assume the other one is 135, right? So, I know people like to use colours, which is very good, but it would be good to use the consistent colour. Like orange based on one is actually the actual, right? And the other one, orange, is the budget on the single page.
All right.
Can you see the difference? So it'd be good to be consistent, because otherwise we read things differently. Now, okay. I think it's easy. You just click, and you click, and it turns into a different color.
It's just a click.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
The other thing that I've actually harped on about in council itself is that it looks like consistently your budget exceeds what you can actually do. Accumulated capex and all that. So is it that we're charging our ratepayers too much because we're not meeting what we have actually budgeted for?
Through the chair, so the capital costs, majority of capital costs occur when in the year subsequent to the capital projects have been completed. And that comes through in terms of recognising depreciation, or when interest costs come, when you have to loan fund some portion of that capital funding. So in the majority of cases, there are some apportionments that do occur in the year that the capital works occur, but the majority occur in the subsequent years. So if we don't achieve as much as what we have, that is not fully on the ratepayers' impact. We only raise debt as and when we need it. And the other things that we have been talking about, there is an impact of not completing some of our works, and we have been stating like, and local government is about renewals is about 70% of what you're expected to be as a full program. And there has been a concerted effort to actually achieving more in alignment with what the budgets have been recorded. And that is kind of reflected in, as reflected in.
So Worship, as Pauline said, we've been pushing really hard on making sure that we hit those budgets. So as at April, we're 76%. So we've got 2 more months worth of invoicing to come in. So I think we would be, I'm going to say that we'll be leading sector if we can, if we keep on tracking the way that we are in terms of that spend.
Yeah, no, it'd be good if you can, because otherwise we won't be doing ourselves any favours by over budgeting and not meeting the actual. And so if that is going to be a continuous trend, that we should note it, but also adjust it. Because when we do the 10-year plan, what happens is that you get all these predictive rate increases, right? But if you can actually lessen them with better policy alignment to actuals, that will be more helpful.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Councillor Seymour.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Microphones, please.
Thank you very much. So while the Chief Executive has just noted we're at 76% of the capital spend, and I won't reiterate what the Minister said, but I'm in his court. Oh, that was the front page. We're now on, if you look to page 128, particularly wastewater, stormwater and water supply. And stormwater, we're at only 11% spent. And those are areas that our communities seek us to make progress on. So I think it's really concerning, and maybe it will come up this afternoon because it falls to the Infrastructure Committee. But, you know, there's quite a gap in our delivery against what we propose. So that's one matter of concern. and I've looked at the explanations. Then over to water supply, where we're talking, which is actually the backup for those kind of figures. There's some explanation on page 132. So I'll get the answer in the end. Then rivers and on the explanation of 05 on page 133 for rivers and drainage, it says it's forecast to start in March. So is that this March, and has it started? Because I just like to think that maybe our reports can be a bit more up to date through the Chief Executive, because we're now in June, and if it did start in March, that would be great, because we'd have made progress. This is in the middle of page 133, and the same applied to a couple of matters yesterday. And I want to observe around the property management and the 56,000 spent on this building that was unbudgeted. The Crime Prevention Camera Trust, who had in their program of funds from council, the police, and formerly Heart of Gisborne, but continuing to be paid, there was a small increase for the year we're in of $3,000, and council couldn't find the $3,000, and yet it was an agreed 10-year plan going over time. But it seems we've found 56,000 of unbudgeted expenditure. So we do need to be consistent and treat everyone fairly and consistently. And then my last question is with respect to the museum replacement, and that's on page 134. And we talk about we all understand it's been well talked about. I'm not sure whether Councillor Cranston's committee had the answer yesterday. We're saying it's going to be completed by September. Now, we all know that some projects are quite time consuming and challenging. Is it still on track to be completed by September? Because we're only repairing it, not re-roofing it. It's under item 15 on page 134.
It never came out yesterday, but I believe it's on track.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
So I think I picked up 3 questions in there. The first one in terms of the infrastructure and the low spend against budget in terms of the stormwater, I believe that's been dealt with several times through the asset committee, and also the carryovers that were approved at the last by that committee to then feed into our annual plan. So the majority of that is in that 700K, as noted in the notes. The issue around the museum roof was being addressed at the committee, but from what I understand, that is on track.
It would be good to know, excuse me, it would be good to know the detail, because on track can mean all sorts of things. And it's just that I know how hard getting roofing done in a timely way, because there's only a limited number of contractors, and we've identified that it is really important. So it would be really good to know if the contract was let.
Sure. I mean, I guess I understand. It's really whether it's the detail that you want in Finance and Audit Committee, or if it's a detail that should be sitting in Community Development Committee.
Well,
and whether it's material overall.
Only because we don't always believe, the things that are written here, because they're sometimes out of date, don't often tell us, sometimes don't tell us what the current situation is.
So I think that was the other question too, was around the timeliness or the information that's coming through. And that's a matter that, unfortunately, given the timing around within which you need an agenda, staff need to feed into that. There is always going to be a delay in between getting the information.
Can I just pursue that further? Because it's about managing the level of information provided to council. And I know you have quite substantial timeframes through the chair, but actually, surely you can work back from that. And if someone's writing a report about something and they're telling us it's March, and it's known that this is going to go to a committee meeting on the 12th or 13th of June, then surely that should trigger an update. Let's make sure the information that's going to be tabled and for ourselves and the public on the 13th of June is more accurate than what it might have been in March. So, I mean, it's just a process thing. It's not like it's new. We've all been around this table for years, and you can get more accurate information, I'm sure. But I understand it's a process that we have to work through, but I don't think it's acceptable in a paper to have data that's telling us what's happening in March when we're meeting almost a whole quarter later in June. Any more than I think it's acceptable for the stormwater budget to only be 11% spent by the 3rd quarter of the year. And we might have had explanations, but it goes back to what His Worship asked earlier. Then why did we rate for that level of money if we weren't planning to spend it? So I just think we need to tighten up our processes.
Can I respond to that? Because I think that in terms of the process that we do run, it's a balance between providing you with accurate information or information on the fly, which at the same time, the council, you've been very clear that you don't want information tabled on the day of. So I'm sure Pauline could pull some data out on any piece of where we're tracking as at today. But in order to give you a proper picture, which is the scope of what finance and audit should be having, is a high-level picture of how the organisation is tracking, we need to be closing off the year end, having sufficient time to analyse that. And there's often a month lead-in time to get these reports onto the table. And that is through an efficient process that we've been putting in place to make sure that they're accurate. So if you've got information requests about information, if you want updates on particular items, give them to Pauline and she can provide them back. But in terms of the process is as lean as we can get in order to turn around the reports to the committee in a timely manner.
Thank you. I appreciate that, but it just doesn't reflect well on our organisation as a whole when several items are so substantial. If this is accurate, and we take it that it is, wastewater, stormwater and water supply are so underdone. That's all.
For the chair, I can just answer and explanations with those. The stormwater has been identified at a number of assets and infrastructure, how one of the projects couldn't proceed because of the design elements of it. And that said, that was always at about December, I believe, that at least 700 or 800 K of that project needed to be carried over into the next financial year. And so that has always been earmarked, and that's why stormwater is quite low. As opposed to the other two, wastewater, there are the Tolaga Bay, which it says is a 300K carryover, which was identified earlier that it couldn't have been completed. And there was some other more minor plant requirements of about 369K that needs to be carried over into next year's annual plan. And the final things is water supply. They are forecasting that the majority of that will be completed by the 30th of June, and there's only 100K of that total program, where it was at the time of this report that was completed. So they still were forecasting that the majority of that would be completed. Just on the part of that is there were, and I was going to go perhaps in the when we closed, just to say what were the updates from when you did the draft annual plan and from where we're coming to the final annual plan. So you can actually see some of the movements, what was it occurred and what were the main drivers for that from when you had your initial discussions and what were the changes that occurred and what were the committee reports that saw some of those decisions that needed to move things into next year. So at the end of this meeting, I can actually go through those changes and actually just give you a bit of an overview before you actually get their report at council. And just with the clarification, you're quite right with the Peel Street toilets, I see in there, it was originally in the draft 280 to be carried over into next year. It was all earmarked at that earlier committee meeting in May, that another 120 would need to be carried over. So next year's Peel Street budget will be recorded at 400K. So that's just clarification. My apologies, I had it wrong in the first instance.
Thank you, Ms. Foreman. Any other questions, Councillor Seymour? Thank you very much, Councillor Seymour. Mr. Hunter.
Yes, I just want to make one more point, continuing on from His Worship the Mayor about costs of only having done 76% of our capital expenditure to budget to date. And I just want to point out that I think the main risk is in delaying projects is the inflationary cost, because those projects can cost considerably more if you're doing them even 6 or 12 months later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunter. If there's nothing else, it's been moved by Councillor Dowsing, seconded by Councillor Stoltz. All those in favour, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Carried. 11.3, write-off statute barred rates, page 137. Moved by Councillor Burdett, seconded by Councillor Dowsing. Any discussion? Your worship, the mayor.
General land. So you've taken all measures within the law to try and recover the money? General land. Like normally it's a notice in the paper to sell, isn't it?
None for sale, but there, we take all due processes we can, and Fiona has actually just wanted to
the general land that's in that report, a lot of it is land that was previously Māori land that was converted in 1967. And until we go through the process of refining our debt policy, didn't want to do any more abandoned land sales and that type of thing. There's some restrictions coming on that. The other land that's in that general land bucket is where the ownership has become defunct. And it is impossible to collect the rates, and they would be ones that would be looking at rating sales. They're very unusual bits of land. Some of them are pieces of land that have been left out in a subdivision, and there's some really unusual ones just down here in Riverside Road, which are just like little corner bits. So it's what most of the general land is. But yes, we do go through the process of where there's a mortgage, we go down that process.
Thank you, Ms. Gray.
Yeah, 1967. That's not that long ago, is it?
No.
33, 52 years.
A couple of days ago. Thank you, Your Worship. Councillor Burdett.
Mr. Chairman, page 142, item 30, the reason why owners aren't discussing their rates liability is because they find the amount of debt overwhelming and in effect impossible to address. I get a number of people talking to me about it, and I refer them to our revenue team rather than me try to be the person that can address it. The Maryland Court the other day, the judge refused to let a sale go through because there was outstanding Maryland rates. And when I asked the question, it wasn't in the court, this was outside. Has this been referred to our rate revenue department? Yes. So these are the examples of some of the issues in terms of Maryland and why the figure gets out of hand. I mean, I don't know what Fiona's opinion is of that, but it's huge. And people won't come forward while they think there's a huge debt there that they've inherited.
Thank you, Councillor Burdett. Any other questions or comments? This has been moved by Councillor Burdett, seconded by Councillor Dowsing. All those in favour say aye. All those opposed? Carried. Now we're in a little bit of a... I'm wondering if maybe we... Okay, yeah, all right. So I'll yes, it's just minutes, right? Yeah, so we'll move into public. So then moved by Councillor Stoltz, seconded by Councillor Seymour. Dowsing. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. I wonder if we adjourn for until then. Oh, I'd actually like to. Sorry. Oh, sorry. In the MPX, yeah.
Yes.
I'll move the meeting be adjourned, seconded by councillor Seymour. All those in favour? All those Thank you, councillors. I'd like to reconvene our meeting at 10:51 a.m. I'd like to welcome Mr. Johansson here amongst us again to discuss with us our item 10.2 Treasury Policy, Change of Interest Rate Risk Control Limits on page 65. He'll be giving us a presentation today. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you. My apologies for being late, weather-related apparently. So quite happy to take questions throughout the presentation. And really the focus is around the change in the interest rate policy, which sits within your liability management policy of council. Here's my clicker. I'm not just by way of background, for folk that don't know me, sort of been working with council since 2006 as independent Treasury advisor. So we provide advice around the ongoing review of the Treasury policy and work with officers around the implementation of that policy. So we meet mainly by telephone every month, looking at the risk position, having good discussions around debt forecasts and capital plans, and provide recommendations around your debt funding strategy and your interest rate strategy. So in terms of the sector, advising sort of 37 councils throughout the sector. So the sector is quite indebted, but 15 billion of debt now within the sector. But today, let's focus first on give an update on the risk positions, both an interest rate perspective and a funding perspective, and that'll be useful in terms of our conversation around the interest rate policy changes. We'll just talk briefly about local government trends, what's happening in the local government sector from our perspective. A brief sort of economic and financial market update, and that will sort of dovetail in quite nicely into the looking forward piece around council's debt strategy and interest rate strategy. So in terms of the current interest rate positions, these should be familiar to you. They'll be in your Treasury report, but importantly, in terms of the parameters within the Treasury policy, they're very consistent with the statutory objectives that council has, particularly around prudent financial management and taking an intergenerational perspective on your risk profile. And certainly stewardship is an important part of the design of the policies for the sector, thinking about not only current ratepayers, but also future ratepayers. So in terms of the interest rate position there, policy compliant. Remember, when we look at the interest rate risk position and the policy, we're wanting some interest rate certainty, and we're wanting to spread our interest rate profile. So one of the hallmarks of successful Treasury management and making sure we don't have any concentration risk at any point in time. So if you look out the next 3 years, about sort of 32 million of your 48.6 million of debt is known. So the 48.6 is your current 12-month debt forecast. That 67% there in the top right is the percentage fixed amount, which has to sit somewhere between 55% and 90%. And then you've got a good spread of exposure. If we go on to the debt position, this is again a snapshot at a time as of the 30th of April. Again, within your policy, just note that 45% of council's debt is maturing in a term greater than 3 years. And certainly looking forward, as there is growth in the debt forecasts, and we are raising that long-term core intergenerational debt, as we refer to it, typically going to have a term of 5 years plus. And remember, those terms you can successfully achieve through the local government funding agency. Is there any questions on those profiles? Right, you haven't got a copy of the slides?
You can do these, please.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, yeah, I'll make sure it gets coming out. You just do it, so.
Okay. Okay, look, with that in mind, we'll just move to the change in the recommended change in the interest rate policy. And what we sort of talk to as a corridor policy framework. And this is a policy that's certainly being adopted by other councils that have growth in their debt forecasts when we're looking at debt out 10 years plus. And this is a style of policy that accommodates managing your interest rate risk over a medium to longer term. So it sort of aligns with the objectives that you're trying to achieve around setting your financial strategy, consulting around your the long-term plan. It does consider the uncertainties that all councils have around managing risk against long-term debt forecasts. So you'll see when you look at the visual representation on the next slide that it's a step down sort of profile. So as you go further out and there's greater uncertainty around those longer term debt forecasts, the percentage that you can manage the underlying floating rate risk to is reducing over time. So in terms of the corridor policy, it aligns to those key council treasury objectives. So when we think about those statutory objectives, about prudent financial management, in our view, and again, giving you interest cost certainty and the spreading of interest rate risk over time. But, you know, it is taking a longer term perspective. So it's giving you more certainty around borrowing costs as you look out, 10 years. You'll have some more of that interest rate risk protected. So just that point 3 there, now remember the current policy looks at a point in time, looks out 12 months. So it's only looking at debt out 12 months. So that $48.6 million figure that I was talking about, that's the expectation for debt, total debt, drawn debt in 12 months' time. But we know if we look at the debt forecast, that's going to be moving up towards 70 million. And at the moment, we're not considering that when we think about long-term interest rate risk. We know it's there, but we haven't got the framework in which to manage ourselves to that risk. Yeah, I suppose that's always going to be the unknown, right? And you'll consider that in terms of where you sit within your risk management framework. So council approves risk limits to executive and management to manage risk or protect a certain amount of that risk going forward. So you're not, in some ways, the policy is restricting, taking too much of a view on interest rates, and it's ensuring that there is some certainty there. So at the moment, the policy is saying 55% of your next 12-month risk needs to be risk managed. So you've only got 45% potentially that could be exposed to floating interest rate risks. But again, the current policy allows you to go up to 90% of that 12-month forecast to remove all of that risk if you want to. So there is a bit of discretion in terms of where you sit with the policy, but in any case, you've always got to be sitting within the policy parameters or the lower band, the 55%, at any point in time, per the current approved policy. So there is, and you'll see when we talk about economic update and interest rate update, there's been significant movements in interest rates. That if we think about wholesale interest rates globally, they're at all-time lows, right? So even the market didn't know where interest rates were going because they were seeing rates go a different direction if you think about September, October last year. So things are changing very quickly. And I suppose one of the important things about interest rate risk management is you're taking away that uncertainty, you're taking away that volatility.
Just
So
a,
it's
just a,
smoothing
a question on that. I mean, we're enjoying historically low interest rates at the moment. If we get to a point where we say, hey, we're happy with that, what's the longest we could lock in, say, I don't know, say about a $10 million loan for? What's the longest what we could lock those in for?
Yes, in terms of the corridor policy, it's allowing you to manage risk out for 15 years. And a lot of that is driven around you can go and borrow from the LGFA out 15 years. So if you're borrowing a maturity of 2033, you'll have floating interest rate risk. You've got, under the new policy, you'll have the ability to manage all of that risk. So generally, the sector is taking a longer term view on debt funding and interest rate risk management because of the nature of long-term infrastructure assets and your ongoing asset management plan horizon is getting longer.
It's just my view at the moment that, you know, maybe we should be really locking in some of our intergenerational debt for as long as we can at the moment. Okay, it's possible it could go even lower, we don't know, but we have to determine a level that, hey, we can live with that, let's lock it in and protect ourselves against, you know, we don't know what it's going to be in 5 years' time. Things might go up to 10% for all we know, but we would have it locked in. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think we'll hold on to that comment and think about that when we look at the new policy. Within the new policy, you'll see the flexibility to be going longer term and doing more hedging than you can do at the moment. But again, question mark in my mind is when you're looking out 5-10 years, it's those debt forecasts, yes. And it's really being clear on what that intergenerational core debt amount will be.
Thank you, Mr. Johansson. Councillor Dowsey has a question.
Thank you. Yes, no, it was actually just a comment on that. It was just that if we look at the draft policy, it indicates that we can put up to 20% of our debt out to 15 years. So in that 10 million example, you can put the entirety out to 15 years if you chose so. But you'd only have in our 100 mil-ish debt cap, you'd only have another 10 million that you could do that with. So yeah.
Yes, so look, the next slide is the visual of the new corridor policy. So the red line there is your long-term debt forecast. Now that is the base case for that debt forecast is the LTP, but then management will do what we call haircut that forecast, given uncertainties around delivery of capital projects. And that's probably a core part of our agenda when we sort of get together monthly is how the asset managers, how the engineers delivering the capital program as per expected. And it's not unknown for carry forwards to be 20% plus across the sector, just the difficulty in delivering capital programs.
Councillor Stoltz.
What I see in this paper, but also in our previous paper, I remember 6-7 years ago that we were carrying 134%, I think. So we had to pay to have the facility for so much more. And we, at this stage in our previous paper, we discussed that we are doing 76% of our capital works now, which is significantly up from the last few years. So both areas are moving in the right direction for us to have the right amount of debt and also charge for what we say we're going to do and do it in the same year. So I'm heartened by what I heard in the previous paper, but also with where we're moving with this.
Yeah, look, we've moved down to close to the minimums of our policy. And certainly we seem to have more control around those debt forecasts. Yeah, and we are haircutting them to be conservative as well.
Councillor Dowsing?
Thank you. The haircut policy is questionable in terms of its use here, though. Whilst we may only deliver 76% of our capital works program, our expenditure against this debt, we don't typically see that as we don't typically see a surplus at end of year to indicate that we wouldn't reach the same debt levels. Traditionally, where we've had lack of delivery, which would be your haircut essentially, we still have spent that budget at end of year. We're not coming in with surpluses each year, and we're not seeing a reduction in debt based on lack of delivery. So how do we manage within our actual debt instead of our projected debt? Because our actual debt is likely to stay higher than our capital delivery program.
Did you want to talk about that?
Okay. Yeah, that you're talking about, have we got more debt than what we anticipated at any particular point in time, and has that grown from some other things that wasn't anticipated? Sometimes some things happen that wasn't expected, but the majority of times we are actually reviewing a heck of in the timeframes, and we're continuously reviewing, are we going to do that? Are we adjusting? So for argument's sake, in our annual plan process, in the previous annual plan process, the long-term plan was reset each year and without minimal changes to those revised. Now we comprehensively go through and check to see, are those projects going to be done? Are we adjusting that? And where do we need to? So we're constantly looking at what that forecasting debt is. Still means we can have to get better, but then we look at other avenues. How do we reduce it? But main part of this is trying to get accurate information of where our debt will be and forecasting the coverage of it. And hopefully we do that by analysing it on a far regular basis than we have before.
I guess my point is that we're making definite improvements. We're making definite improvements in our delivery, and last year we were on budget, which was great. We still didn't deliver the full capital works program, but without seeing surpluses, should we be haircutting? Is my question, because we're still achieving the same debt level that we projected, and yet not. So just the haircutting element of it, to me, here it shows that we're going to peak our debt at 73 million or something like that because of the haircut. And we know we're going to reach our full debt cap. Anyone here who believes that we're not going to reach the full debt cap is probably a little bit misguided.
For the Chair, just to answer that, previously, and it says it in the actual paper, that we were in a situation of being overhedged, about 120%. We had expectations that we were going to deliver these capital projects, and because of that, we took swaps to cover the interest risk. What this is saying, could that happen again if we're not that good at our capital expenditure? And this allows us to take a haircut and saying, okay, let's have a look at any particular time. We're not going to reach those things, and actually review that process. So it's a continuous review rather than trying to get into an overhedge position. That's what that is kind of, it's just assessing it at each particular time.
We have another question over here. Councillor Seymour.
My question actually was for the chief executive, was more specific, but along the lines of Councillor Downing. I mean, if we look at that slide up there, and the year 4 peak, which we are going to need, is there any potential to renegotiate that? I mean, internally we know we will be, but do we have to go to the public if we say we're in an LTP complication, say we're pushing it out? A lot of that is a swimming pool and wastewater treatment. So can we push it out without, and so that we're more realistic without going to the public, is effectively what I'm saying?
Well, it would actually just depend on the level of materiality in there, and if you're within your financial strategy, so I think is it year 3 we've got $105 million. So if you were to push it out, you'd be doing that anyway through your annual plan process where you're disclosing what any material differences are. So I'd have to look into it closer. My gut feel is that it's a disclosure thing rather than a material impact, but I'm just talking on the fly at the moment. So, yeah.
In year 4.
But then bear in mind, you're also going through in year 3 your LTP anyway.
Another LTP is coming up pretty quickly.
Yeah, and that's some of the deliberate timing, phasing decisions that we were made, or recommendations that were made, so that it allowed you, once you came to that year 3 and reset of the long-term plan, to make decisions to push it further out.
Thank you, Ms. Thatcher Swan. Just cognizant of our time, but Councillor Cranston?
Yeah, thank you. Is there any sort of debt reduction on a per project basis? What I'm saying is if we go out and get 10 million for a project, have we got a debt reduction on that, or does it just keep rolling over in the general debt? Because I'm talking about intergenerational fairness, I think. So we get 10 million and we decide that the people are willing to pay 5% on that. The next generation comes along and they've got that same debt on that project, but their interest rate is 8% on that. So is there any, does the debt come down on that project? So then it's more fair because they're paying interest on a lower amount? Do you get what I'm saying there?
Yeah, the proxy to pay for that is how much depreciation comes, that's our cash flow. And as our, the way that we manage our debt, we look at all of our cash flows that we've got. And if we don't need to draw down debt, we won't. So if there's money coming in for, with regards to depreciation, that's the recognition between intergeneration. The wear and tear of that asset is actually rated for as it's been used up.
Yeah. Do you think that would be covered with a big raise in interest rate?
If it's a raise in interest rate, we'll have to increase rates.
Yeah.
If it's not covered from our liability, with our interest risk liability. Yeah, that's the only thing. It will just be means that rates will increase.
So this type of policy will give you more certainty in terms of those long-term internal loans the council has got. So the other observations, just those hard black lines are your percentages. That's your corridor looking out 15 years. And it calibrates itself against the debt forecast. So if you change that debt forecast, that the corridor will change. And you've got your current swap portfolio there, being the brown block. You can see when you look further out, year 4 plus, that you're below minimums. So this policy will require you to do at least some hedging, get back to minimums. But our recommendation would be, particularly when you're looking out sort of 6 years plus, that you start building up your interest rate protection towards that midpoint, and that's the dotted line that moves through the sort of like the centre of the corridor. So it's only giving you a lot more flexibility to do more risk management, and it just so happens that rates are certainly attractive at the moment and make good sense from an intergenerational perspective. So the policy gives you the flexibility to be able to do more hedging based on your term risk. Okay.
I'm going to give the opportunity to get to the presentation.
Yeah. Look, moving forward, there's some trends around the local government sector. Look, I just talk about the credit rating agency because, with your debt going up to those levels, you start to get in the realm of thinking about, do I need a credit rating or don't I need a credit rating? And so there's 2 credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Fitch, that rate the sector. They're becoming a lot more focused on liquidity management. So it's no longer are they comfortable with the LGFA, knowing that the LGFA is there and you can borrow through the LGFA. They want to see firm commitments. So they're encouraging the sector to pre-fund upcoming debt maturities before they mature. And we do that as a council, and the policy allows us to do that up to 12 months. And also they're focusing on upcoming CapEx. So capital programs that are coming up in the next 12 to 18 months, they're looking to see the sector raise that debt well in advance. Okay, they're very nervous about market disruptions and what that does in terms of being able to deliver to the capital program. So that's really starting to shape some of the strategies around liquidity and debt management. Up to 18 months. Up to 18 months.
Often it takes a lot longer than to actually deliver it than we anticipate. So even if we were to go down the track that you're suggesting, borrowing 18 months ahead, we're probably not going to do the project for 2.5 years if we're lucky. So
That's
we
true.
have charged the ratepayers for the interest, even if it's only the interest, on that loan in advance of doing the project. And then some projects stall for even longer than that, like public toilets in Peel Street, which we'd have gone to the market for the money for donkeys ages ago. Roofs on museums, you know, that's
so that links right back to the discussion around debt forecasts. So
yes,
again,
but, you know,
the debt
LGFA
forecasts
should think about what they're putting upon local government, because as entities, because they have to understand those constraints that 50% of councils across New Zealand would have.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point because they've been consulting on it, and that was exactly the point that we wanted to get some more clarification around them, given the uncertainties that you're talking about. So again, we're talking about haircutting those expectations.
Are you able to enunciate those concerns in your consultation with them?
We've done that, yeah.
And what did they take it on board?
Well, we don't know yet, but we're hopeful. That's all I can say at the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Seymour. Councillor Thompson, question?
Did I sort of hear a tone in your speech to this slide that suggests there's a change in the way that they lend? Like we've heard for years where councils, everybody's happy to lend as much as they can to councils because they're safe and they can just sell up people. Did I think that there's a bit of a change in the feeling?
No, I think it's just, you have to recognise that borrowing from the LGFA is uncommitted. They will always do best efforts, but if there's a market disruption, for instance, a global disruption in funding markets, it may well be that they can't raise that money at that time. So the rating agencies are going back to 2007, 2008, and the learnings from the global financial crisis.
So there's definitely some language in there that we sort of haven't asked. I know like the GMC, like it was still at the start of a fairly low interest rate zone, but overnight it went back up 8%, because they just couldn't get funds and because money was tight. If you were looking for new money, it was just hard to find. So is that anticipation of possibly that happening?
Yes. Yeah, I think again, we come back to the statutory objectives and prudent financial management. That comment I made about, 45% of your debt has got a maturity date greater than 3 years. We are continuing to sort of forward manage all of that risk so we don't get ourselves in a situation that we need to access cash and we can't.
So, but that's what language in the mix. I refer that to my colleague over here, or where you say, where I suggested that we find a point where we get comfortable and say, hey, we could save it by floating it, but it's sort of long-term picture, and that should be in our thinking.
That's certainly in terms of live current debt, absolutely, plus reasonably certain long-term debt, forecast debt. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. Please proceed.
Okay. The other point to note is the LGFA in terms of their lending policy. So there's some changes there around direct lending to CCOs and CCTOs. And what does that mean for councils and providing credit support down to those entities? And so they're not yet doing it. There's still a way to go in terms of the LGFA's lending policy, but that's certainly coming up. So again, councils are reflecting on that and what does that mean for themselves. We've talked about capital mishits. I won't dwell on that again, but again, what a council is doing, they're increasing resourcing and particularly around project management to make sure projects are done. Internal borrowing, certainly councils are thinking about internal borrowing, and over the years we've seen borrowing rates come down, and so effectively their rate of return on the internal borrowings has come down as well. So councils suddenly reflecting on the intergenerational objectives around the investment in yourself, and so that's asking questions around diversification and protecting the real capital value of your investment. So that may lead to more diversified investment portfolios. So just a switch of the asset type that some councils may have on their balance sheet. Infrastructure, big infrastructure deficit across the sector. So Treasury is very much looking at how can we fund infrastructure, particularly for high growth councils, and not have that debt sitting on councils' balance sheets. So that's a work stream that's happening with Treasury at the moment. And just something around the LGFA, we're talking about pre-funding of debt. And, one of the issues with pre-funding debt is you gross up your balance sheet and it mucks around your net debt to revenue calculation. So debt blends and extends, forward starting debt in a year's time is all mechanisms that the LGFA's put in place to enable you to get that forward commitment. You've got that debt refinanced and repriced, but it's not actually sitting on council's balance sheet as of that point in time. So there are some mechanisms that the LGFA's got to ensure that your balance sheet isn't unnecessarily sort of grossed up. Okay. In terms of the obligation, yeah. Yeah, so it's a good question in terms of if you've done a forward start and you're at the 30th of June, how do you disclose that in the financial statements? It's a good question. It's a question I'll take away and ask. Yeah, because it is. Yep. Right. Carrying on. Just note that the LGFA is raised 9 billion now. Still maintains that AA+ credit rating. Sort of doing a very good job in terms of funding the sector. And these are very colourful lending rates of the LGFA, and I'll probably look at that yellow line, and that's where the LGFA is raising long-term debt, and you can see that downward slope in that yellow line, but there's a few bumps on the way. So we want to be proactive and opportunistic when we go into the LGFA tenders, because despite the strong credit rating of the LGFA, it is impacted by what's happening globally, and we know global sentiment changes. But it's a solid, strong asset type, and the market is looking for LGFA type investments, and that's really helping keeping the price that LGFA pays for its long-term debt at the lower sort of bounds of it's the 2033, which is now about 14 years out, but that's their longest tenor. So that typically is where the long-term sovereign funds will go and invest, money managers, and it's the banks typically will be investing in the shorter dated LGFA maturities. And there's a constant demand for that paper. So you're not seeing those spreads move around as much. But again, it's what's happening globally, which is impacting those long-term rates. In terms of economic update, look, not new news to you, but obviously banking business confidence is low, and businesses remain very grumpy. Costs are increasing; they're not able to pass through those costs. There's policy uncertainty, and also global uncertainty. So what you're seeing, what we concentrated on, is that black line there, and that's the own activity index, and that's quite a good lead indicator in terms of GDP growth in New Zealand. GDP growth in New Zealand is slowing down. It's 2.3% at the moment. We're getting some more GDP data on the 20th of June. We're expecting it to continue to weaken. And that means that the economy is really struggling to generate inflation, CPI inflation, right? The way that the Reserve Bank looks at inflation. So here's a chart in terms of GDP growth. You can see it's sort of slowing there, that red line. You can see how the Reserve Bank needs to forecast GDP growth. Its forecast back in February was seeing growth pick up in New Zealand, and its forecast in May monetary policy statement sees it continuing to slow down, and that's why they've stimulated monetary policy by reducing the official cash rate from 1.75 to 1.5, and there's more to come. Certainly another one, and it may well be, we do see a 1% OCR in New Zealand. They really are wanting to generate inflation back up at 2%. And remember, at the moment, it's 1.5%. So they're expecting, you see that yellow line there, it's sort of like you can see they're expecting the stimulus will drive GDP growth higher. There's a bit of fiscal stimulus coming through, of course, from what the government's doing around the well-being budget, but I suppose that's where the risk is around GDP outlook in terms of will we get back to 3%. The labour market's not too bad actually, but unemployment rate of 4.2. Remember, the Reserve Bank has a dual mandate, 2% inflation over the medium term, and also fully sustainable employment. But you can see employment growth is slowing down, which is not untypical for when growth slows down as well. So strong employment growth would typically generate higher labour costs, and as unemployment goes down and the labour market gets tight, generally you would see wages go up, and this is a dilemma that a lot of central banks are facing globally, is we're not getting the wage price inflation that we have been used to, and with wage price inflation, that helps stimulate GDP growth and it helps stimulate inflation. So that's a bit of a dilemma we've got in New Zealand and also globally. So we need to see sort of unemployment rate go down even further to try and create those capacity constraints to drive wage growth higher. We are getting some through policy changes, particularly around minimum wage and the resetting of other wages to minimum wage increases. So, but when we look at inflation in New Zealand, it's, we talk about low inflation, and it's that yellow line there, that, core inflation at 1.7%. But we actually do have non-tradable inflation that's at 2.8%, which is a 5-year high. But the inflation, the other side of the inflation basket is this imported deflation. So we're just buying goods cheaper and cheaper from overseas. And that's what's taking that part of the inflation basket closer to zero, you see. So we stubbornly have that brown line you can see across the page below zero. And this is the imported deflation we get out of the likes of China and Asia as goods and services get cheaper and cheaper. Tariffs will be a different story. We know we're talking a lot about import tariffs. That'll actually increase import costs. Whether Reserve Banks, central banks will look at that or not, it's another question. They may just see that as a one-off influence. They're not really influencing broad inflation, and therefore will continue to keep the stimulus there in the respective economies. And so we talked about swap rates, wholesale interest rates lower to where they were back in June 18. They are lower as the world growth outlook slows down and central banks struggle to generate inflation. The only economy that really has got inflation is the US. And their central bank back in October said, we're going to continue to increase rates. They're at 2.5, they're going to 3, and they're going to keep on going. Today, they're saying, I'm happy to stay at 2.5. And by the way, the interest rate markets are expecting 2, maybe 3 interest rate cuts in the US. The old story used to be, if the US economy is growing, it'll drag the rest of the world out of its slumber. Well, we haven't seen that. We've seen China slow down, but Europe slowing down. They're caught between a rock and a hard place because they're already trying to stimulate from the last crisis, the Great Recession back in 2008. So they're back to where they started from. So hence, interest rates likely to be lower for longer. So we talk about managing long-term interest rate. Yes, we want to do that, but the bias is not higher in the next 6 months. It's probably going to be across the page, and if there is a bias, it's probably going to be lower as central banks try to continue to stimulate. So just thinking about that, when we think about our strategy piece, so we've got the policy and now implementing our strategy. So quite comfortable to have exposure to short-term interest rates in New Zealand. So going down to the minimum of the policy, particularly when you're looking at the new side of policy where you can be very structured in the way you look at that. So over the next sort of 3 years, continue to manage exposure at minimums, but you start to manage that long-term interest rate exposure. We've got no risk management there at the moment. We need to start sort of building up that protection. And we think about 10-year wholesale rates in New Zealand, they're below 2% now. We believe now's a good time to start chipping away at that and building up that protection, rather average in, rather than sit there and say and wait for the absolute lows. They make sense, which they do. Let's start managing that long-term risk. Funding strategy, this gets back to debt forecast, but we know that we've got debt, existing core debt that's refinancing. We're typically looking at refinancing that 12 months in advance to remove that refinancing risk and get some certainty around costs. Just so happens that the cost of doing that is not, it's a positive cost at the moment, or it's a benefit. I don't think there's such thing as a positive cost, is there? But, and just in terms, because we generally will take that money and put it on term deposit and leave it there for when the debt is maturing. So continue to do that, but then it's all about debt's going up like this. We need to be thinking about how are we going to fund that? How much pre-funding of that CapEx do we do? And points taken from what you said today, understand that. Liquidity, always maintain our liquidity position at least minimums. So we've always got some committed cash for a rainy day. Okay, so we will always continue to do that. And big focus on the upcoming capital program. And I think there is a conversation around the credit rating as well. So remember, credit rating comes at a cost, but there is a benefit in terms of you borrowing your money from the LTFA. But there are other responsibilities as well, because you have another stakeholder looking over your shoulder in terms of the broader activities of council. So something to be sort of well thought through. And then I'm finished.
Oh, you have finished?
I have,
Okay.
yes.
Any other questions around the table in regards to the presentation in relation to the paper that we have in front of us, 10.2? Moved by Councillor Dowsing. Second by Councillor Foster. Any other questions for our... It's moved item 1 and item 2, right? So, the recommendations as written.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'll move both 1 and 2. I'd also like to comment that it's good to see that our current policy is working very well in the current financial situation, the current interest situation where we show to be tracking to the minimum of the new policy anyway. which means we're handling that debt accordingly for the current financial climate. So yeah, well done on the way it's been handled.
Thank you for those comments, Councillor Dowsing. Mr. Hunter.
Oh, just one thing. Do you have any concerns about the forecast level of debt for this council in comparison with others? I mean, will there be any premium applied to the borrowing we have as we double and close to triple our debt over the next 5 years?
Yeah, the important piece of that is your borrowing limits with the LGFA. And I know in the past they've been set reasonably conservatively, if my memory serves me correctly, 95% net debt, 90 to total revenue, and you've got the ability to go up to 175. And that would still be considered within the realms of reasonableness, but I think it always comes back to each council affordability. Yeah.
Microphone, please, Mr. Hunter.
So you feel reasonably comfortable with the debt levels that we're looking at in the future?
So my question would be, where does that take your, going to 70 million, where does that take your net debt to revenue?
That's 105.
Yeah, that would be conservative. Looking at the sector, yeah. But again, I say it's all back to the affordability of your specific ratepayer base, and that's where the focus needs to obviously sit.
Thank you, Mr. Johansson. If there's no other questions or comments around the table, I'd like to move this paper. All those in favour say aye. All those opposed? Carried. And that is the content of our agenda. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate your guys' time today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Johansson. I'll call this meeting closed. Thank you.